So here we have a story in John chapter 2 about the wedding in Cana where Jesus turns the water into wine. So here's kind of how it starts out. The next day there was a wedding celebration in the village of Cana. Now Cana was probably about a mile or so from Nazareth where Jesus grew up. Anyway, Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding, to the celebration. So the wine supply ran out during the festivities, so Jesus' mother told him they have no more wine. And again, Jesus probably knew these folks because he was invited, and it's very possible that they were friends or even possibly relatives of some sort. So Mary had this deep desire to make sure that the wedding went fine, and she was somewhat distraught when she says, "They've no more wine. Jesus, can you help? You need to do something." One thing about a wedding in Jewish custom, and that is you had to have wine. A wedding lasted about 7 days, so you had to have plenty of wine. And wine was a symbol of God's abundance, that God was blessing you and your family. So to not have wine for your invited guests was really a tragedy. And in that world, it was more, not just a tragedy, like, oh no, there's not enough wine, but really it was a disgrace on the family, like you've invited us and you haven't provided. And that is just a terrible faux pas. And the family would have lived in infamy, in disgrace, obviously, for a long time because there wasn't enough wine. They ran out. So it was more than just an inconvenience. It was a tragedy. So wine is a symbol of God's blessing. Here the Bible shows us that we can't experience life in its abundance if our spiritual lives are empty. There's no more wine. In our own lives, there's no more wine. Surely we try to fill our empty jars with just about anything. Remember, there were the ceremonial jars that were empty, and Jesus told them to fill them up. Well, the ceremonial jars, think of our lives as like God has created us in his image, but spiritually we are empty. There's nothing in us. So we try to fill them with all kinds of things. But really, as we try to fill our lives with all kinds of things, in this water that Jesus told them to fill the jars up, it's like the water is what bland and tasteless, and it's just water. There's no life in it. So you can't have a wedding without wine, and you can't experience life the way God intended it without Jesus. It's merely impossible. But Jesus supernaturally saves the day. Here we read, Jesus told the servants, "Fill the jars with water." When the jars had been filled, he said, "Now dip some out and take it to the master of ceremonies." When the master of ceremonies tasted the water that was now wine, not knowing where it had come from, though of course the servants knew, he called the bridegroom over. "A host always serves the best wine first," he said, "but then when everyone has had a lot to drink, he brings out the least expensive wine. But you have kept the best until now." So Jesus gives us a picture of his abundance. It gives us a picture of the abundance of his inexhaustible grace. The miracle is that God takes ordinary people, ordinary things, ordinary events, and changes them into new wine and gives them to us as gifts of love and grace, gifts that strengthen, encourage, and heal. Now, like the servants who knew that Jesus was the source of the water turning into wine, we as Christians are tasked with sharing the good news as well. It would be a good thing then to know and live in the presence of Christ, for out of that we can confidently share what he has done for us. Just imagine what would have been going through the minds of the servants and even the disciples as Jesus told the servants to fill the jars with water. Fill them with water, he tells them. And then he says, take a cup and give it to the master of ceremonies and to make sure and have him taste it. So after he tasted it, what sort of awe and incredible sense of a marvelous thing has happened, something different, something no one has ever seen before. I would think that the servants and even the disciples were like, you know what, I've seen it, but I got to taste it for my own. I've got to see what this really tastes like. Did he really turn the water into wine? I've got to try that myself. And then, of course, when they did do that, wouldn't you be telling others the water was turned to wine? What a marvelous testament! What a great example of what God has done. And here we find then in John 2:11 it says, "This miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory, and the disciples believed in him." So Jesus turns the water into wine. Everyone saw it, they tasted, they experienced it themselves. And I just think that in a situation like that, you wouldn't be sitting back going, you know what, I've heard it. I mean, everyone's talking about it. Obviously, there's something different. The sommelier, the master of ceremonies, who would have been an expert in wine, tasted the wine and said, this is the best wine he's ever had. And You've saved the best for last. Who does that? So we get a picture here of Jesus's goodness. He comes in and he takes our old lives full of emptiness, and even though we try to fill them with water and bland things, he comes in and he creates new wine. He creates us into a new person. We are a new creation now in Jesus. And because of them seeing that, the disciples seeing that, they said, this is the Messiah. They believed in him. They believed that he was the Messiah. I'm going to read a quote from Giorgio Papini. He says, the men of old gave the good and then the poor wine. He, Jesus, after the good wine, gives better, sour, unripened wine. The poor quality which was drunk at the beginning symbolizes the wine of the old law, the wine that has turned sour and can no longer be drunk. Christ's wine, finer and stronger, which cheers the heart and warms the blood, is the new wine of the kingdom, wine intended for the marriage of heaven and earth, wine which gives that divine intoxication which will be called later the foolishness of God. So that's what has to happen in our own lives. We come to God spiritually empty, broken, and no life in us, and something has to happen. Jesus shows up and he changes our lives from the old to the new, from the old to no wine to new wine, from water to wine. He is the one who does those things. He is the author and finisher of our faith. And then it's important for us to spend time in the presence of Christ, to get to know him and understand who he is, and trust him as our Lord and Savior, and then spend time in his presence so that we too, like the servants, can go around and share the good things that Christ has done for us.